Hi, my name is Antika Roy. I have completed my Bachelor of Science from Chittagong University of Engineering and Technology in Bangladesh. This research work has been conducted in collaboration with Dr. Pablo Rivas and Mahinur Taiba from Baylor University. The title of our paper is Unsupervised Machine Learning Methods for Diagnosing Autism Spectrum Disorder Using Multimodal Data, a Survey. Before digging deep into the study, we need to get familiarized with the term autism spectrum disorder and autism. Although every child develops at slightly different paces, almost everyone learns the same set of skills like language and communication, problem solving, physical milestones like walking, crawling, and fine motor skills, more or less at about the same time. If one of those doesn't develop as expected, it may be described as a type of neurodevelopmental disorder. It can result in isolation, which is where the term autism originated from. In the fifth edition of Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the term autism spectrum disorder, in short ASD, was first introduced, which includes all developmental disorders as a spectrum that differentiates based on the severity of two major areas. First, deficits in social communication and interaction, and second, restrictive or repetitive behaviors, interests, and activities. For the social and communication area, there are four subcategories. The first one is social reciprocity, which refers to how children respond or reciprocate in social interactions. Second area of potential deficit is joy and attention. Next, there is non-verbal communication, like the child won't put their arms out when they want to be picked up. The last subcategory of communication deficits is in social relationships. Um, the other major area are called restrictive and repetitive behaviors. For instance, lining up toys in a specific way or flapping hands. The child might be fixed on certain routines. Now, we look into the current statistics of autism spectrum disorder. Autism in the United States has increased by more than 200% from 2000 to 2018. In 1998, the Centers for Disease Control began monitoring the prevalence of autism spectrum disorder and the traits of children with ASD in the United States. According to the report from 2018, one in every 44 child has autism. Currently, more than 3.5 million Americans living with an autism spectrum disorder. According to the World Health Organization, one in every 100 children has autism. It's a fact that autism spectrum disorder is becoming more widespread across the United States. There is no consensus on why the prevalence of the condition is continuing to rise. Theories range from more awareness to better diagnosis to genetic mutations, even to environmental factors. The first and foremost challenges doctor and clinicians face is the heterogeneous nature of autism. Heterogeneity means diversity or variability. Autism may be thought of as combinations of symptoms from several domains with various degrees of severity. Some child with autism are verbal while others are non-verbal. Some have higher intellectual abilities than others. Some children can show comorbid symptoms like anxiety and attention deficits, at the same time sensory dysfunctions and metabolic disorders, etc. The second challenge is early diagnosis. Early detection is very, very helpful for the children to make the most of their strengths and provide them with the potential for a better and more independent life throughout the childhood and well beyond. Delayed diagnosis can result in difficult behaviors, social isolation, and difficulty in attending schools and social life. Unfortunately, most children with ASD are not diagnosed until they are 4 years old, which means they are missing the most important time to be treated. Reasons behind this includes parents' reluctance to identifying and recognizing the symptoms, as well as lack of trained professionals. Moreover, a full assessment may include a physical examination, genetic and blood test, brain scans, a thorough family and developmental history, and other sensory assessments. A comprehensive assessment and accurate diagnosis can provide support for the child and his family. But such accuracy requires time and assessment across different contexts. It's more than just click the criteria and get the medicine. Now I will discuss the motivation for using machine learning in autism spectrum disorder. We can use machine learning to analyze vast clinical records to enhance patient outcomes, to speed up the innovation of treatments and remedies and computerized repetitive tasks and reduce the chance of human mistakes. Further, recent advancements in neuroscience and brain imaging have opened the door to understanding the function and structure of the brain in more detail. Researchers are working with machine learning methods to work with the relationship among various brain regions and their feature vectors. Um, the application of machine learning methods will ultimately improve not only our ability to diagnose these disorders, but also augment our understanding of the mechanism that contribute to their etiology. For example, association between autism and their parents' use of substances such as caffeine and certain antidepressants. Here I'm going to describe different types of machine learning and why I have chosen unsupervised machine learning method. There are four major categories of machine learning: supervised, unsupervised, semi-supervised, and reinforcement learning. Supervised learning is task-oriented, which works with leveled dataset. Unsupervised learning is a data-driven approach where we actually cluster and analyze unlabeled data. Semi-supervised learning involves a small number of labeled examples and a large number of unlabeled examples. And reinforcement learning learns from its own mistakes. While there have been many applications of supervised machine learning with autism spectrum data, unsupervised methods have also been used in ASD research. Unsupervised machine learning includes methods such as clustering and dimensionality reduction that aim to find the latent structure in data. Large amounts of autism spectrum disorder data is created through hospitals, therapy centers, and mobile applications. However, much of this rich data does not have pre-existing classes or labels. Huge amounts of genetic and behavioral data that are collected as a part of scientific studies or as a part of treatment can provide a deeper insight into both diagnosis and treatment of autism. Our paper offers an in-depth assessment of studies that use the most commonly used unsupervised machine learning techniques, such as k-means clustering and hierarchical clustering. K-means clustering, each data point is assigned to the nearest cluster, applying Euclidean distance to keep the centroids as compact as possible after locating k-centroid. Clustering is actually a task of dividing the data sets into a certain number of clusters in such a manner that data points belonging to a cluster have similar characteristics. In hierarchical clustering, the clusters are forming with an ascending order from top to bottom, which is often shown as a tree diagram known as dendrogram. The dendrogram ends with a set of clusters where each cluster holds similar items within itself but differs from the others. We usually see two kinds of hierarchical clustering strategies. First one is agglomerative clustering, which is a bottom-up approach. The other is a divisive hierarchical clustering, which is a top-down approach. In this slide, I'm going to show how we conducted our research work. In our literature evolution, we analyzed how k-means clustering and hierarchical clustering approaches have been used recently in autism spectrum disorder diagnosis. We have searched for related publications through Google Scholar, Science Direct, and PubMed databases from the years 2016 to 2022. We thoroughly analyzed the abstract and methodology portion of the publications. For the selection of an article, we kept a few criteria in mind. First, the study should contain diagnosis data of people with autism. Second, the research work should be a peer-reviewed journal publication. Third, the k-means clustering and hierarchical clustering method have to be used. Finally, the impact factor of the selected paper should be more than 4. We discovered more than 50 publications by studying abstract reviews of these papers. The methodology and discussion of the publications was analyzed in depth, and 18 of them met the aforementioned requirements, while the others were excluded from the survey. Now, this is the visual representation of our overall research. Among the selected publications, k-means clustering was applied in 7 of the papers, and the rest of the papers implemented hierarchical clustering approach. We individually analyzed the types of data and the overall objective, key contributions, and limitations of each of the papers. The graph shows that hierarchical clustering was the most widely used technique between the two methods. The goal of these studies was to distinguish clusters that are homogeneous on some scale. Within autism spectrum disorder, researchers have looked to identify subgroups in some areas of behavioral, genetical, sensory, or neurological sector. Hierarchical clustering also offers a practical advantage for clinicians who may need flexible in choosing the number of groups they want to work with. For example, if the optimal number of clusters is 5, if the clinicians want to create 2 separate treatment plans or diagnosis, they can do so using hierarchical clustering. Now I'm going to discuss some important findings from the papers we reviewed. In 3 of the studies on neuroimaging data, researchers highlighted how k-means clustering and hierarchical clustering algorithms were utilized to detect distinct group of patterns of functional connectivity of regions of the brain in individuals with ASD and controls using resting state fMRI data. Inspired by early coactivation pattern studies, researchers applied hierarchical clustering to classify the image volumes of the resting state fMRI data from young adults with autism spectrum disorder and their typically developing controls. They introduced an alternative to functional connectivity analysis by gathering non-sequential brief instances of similar fMRI brain volumes into larger coactivation pattern clusters. In our research with genotypic and phenotypic variables, we found that implementing different clustering analysis on genotypic and phenotypic variables can really help differentiate more genetically homogeneous people in autism spectrum. Recent studies have demonstrated that subgrouping ASD based on their clinical phenotypes is useful for identifying candidate genes that are dysregulated in ASD subgroups. Furthermore, researchers examined the proteome profiles of ASD patients and discovered that distinctive proteins are expressed differently in a subset of ASD people who have severe language impairment. We pointed out that classifying patients with respect to both behavioral and biological features will allow the clinicians to give more targeted treatment. These groups can also be used to help clinicians understand more about the mechanisms underlying the treatment plans by allowing them to see who is benefiting most from the different types and intensity of treatment and support. We analyzed a study on structural language and nonverbal ability profiles in children with ASD, including verbal children with all levels of intellectual abilities. Findings from the cluster analysis shows that bilingual children end up in each of the profiles, which clearly indicates that a bilingual language environment for a kid with autism doesn't actually impede the adequate structural language functioning. We also found that hierarchical clustering can be applied on electrophysiological data to group autistic and typically developing participants into clusters based on the loudness dependency of their brain responses to auditory tones. Cluster analysis in genetic and metabolic biomarkers. Moreover, the combination of genetic findings and clinical observations in autism spectrum can define a situation in which frequent and unusual variants combine to create a diagnosis. Metabolic testing can provide important biomarkers toward identifying the abnormalities of biological process underlying a person's autism spectrum disorder. One study actually tried to identify a subset of autism spectrum disorder with people based on their vitamin B6 responsiveness. Now I will talk about the school system and policies for children with autism may be shaped by findings from the reading and mathematical abilities of autistic children. Much of the ASD literature concentrates on the finding and the significance of social and behavioral support for children with autism spectrum disorder. A study on autistic children without intellectual disabilities found that many of the autistic children spend a significant portion of their day in inclusive general educational classroom. Current research suggests that a significant subset of autistic children struggle with reading or mathematical achievement in their classroom. This study used hierarchical cluster analysis to investigate the achievement profiles of autistic children who don't have any intellectual disabilities. However, in order to provide an appropriate education that best promotes academic achievement in this type of autistic children, more information on the factors related to individual differences in academic achievement is required. The findings have important implications for the general education system. There is a lack of understanding of how to best support classroom learning for these children. More precise estimates of differences in learning abilities in is necessary for creating educational environments with adequate learning support. In case of hiring policies and employers, we have reviewed a study which explores the policies and practices of employers with the ultimate goal of understanding shortcomings in employment policies, the practices that can be improved through a combination of educational programs and changes in corporate culture. In this study, researchers explored the policies and practices and perceptions of employers with regard to individuals with high functioning autism spectrum disorder. By understanding the landscape of these practices, they hope to be able to improve support services for the individuals on the autism spectrum who are seeking employment. The data analyzed in these clusters allow researchers to compare the hiring practices of businesses who tend to hire employees with autism spectrum disorder versus who don't. By understanding the breakdown of hiring practices in this way, researchers will be better able to understand the components that allow for successful hiring and retention of employees with autism spectrum disorder. After analyzing all the studies, we identified three major limitations. The majority of research papers share a problem with smaller dataset. Therefore, bigger scale research studies are required to determine whether cluster organization stays consistent across bigger groups of autism spectrum disorder patients or not. Secondly, age and gender are two most important factors to consider in autism spectrum disorder studies because results may vary depending on the patient's age or gender. For example, gender disparities in challenging behaviors on the spectrum should be considered when treating them. Also, K-means clustered subtypes differed dramatically because age wasn't adjusted for the functional connectivity data. Finally, some aspects of autism spectrum disorder research require validation and future development, such as sensorial attributes. Further psychometric feature evaluation is needed. To summarize my main points, clustering in unsupervised machine learning offers clinicians and researchers a practical way to leverage individual variations among persons with ASD to advance diagnosis and better understand patients at different levels on the spectrum. In this review, we studied different data types that may reveal various underlying patterns of autism spectrum data, all of which may offer distinct and complementary information and clinical value. To consolidate the studies on unsupervised machine learning in ASD, additional research is required on the clustering techniques and contributions and limitations, and the overall challenges of the studies discussed in this paper can serve as a model for the future researchers. This brings me to the end of the presentation. Thank you all for listening.